Everyone, and welcome once again to Pondy's Tache. My name is Bob Irvine, and we are joined today by James Downie, David Welford, and Jon Scoltock. So the first two are the Yorkshire Mafia, and the third one has got the most beautiful fringe I think I've ever seen in my life. Incredible. Before we start, guys, I've got to say a wee shout out to the sponsors. So thank you very much to scottishgritting.com and to Harkness Competition Tyres. So tonight we'll be concentrating on the best era for the BRC in our opinion, the 70s, 80s and the 90s. I think it's fair to say that we ruffled a few feathers in the last meeting. Online there was a few comments. We missed out people like Andy Burton. There's quite a few. Even the Land Rovers at the end of the field that I mentioned has been the best ever. It was very strange. So what we'll do is kick off with the 70s. And James, what is your thoughts on the 70s? What do you think of somebody mentioned 70s rallying to you?
Very difficult to think of the 70s without thinking of Roger Clark, Cossack Escort, winning quite a lot of things. The 70s, from what I am aware of, and I'll admit that I didn't actually attend rallies till the 80s when I was about 8 years old. But I've seen the videos, read the books, read the old Autosport reports, and it is certainly the second half of the decade is fantastic. You had other manufacturers starting to join the series about 76. It became very competitive very quickly. I think if you looked at the early 70s, it's quite easy to dismiss it as just, Roger Clark and nobody else. There's no point anybody else turning up. I was a bit deeper into that. And although he did win quite a lot of the championships, I think a lot of the time he didn't actually enter a lot of events. He was away doing world events. And he did have insurers like Billy Coleman actually winning the title, which surprised me when I kind of found that out. So it wasn't all a Clark fest, but certainly the late 70s were fantastic. The rallies were great. The competition was great. You had the young Finnish drivers coming over and suddenly setting it alight, Harry Vatten and Pentti Rickler in particular. And you suddenly had the Triumphs, Vauxhalls, Talbot getting involved, Saab coming over, and suddenly it became the championship that everybody wanted to do in the late 70s. So for me, it's a cracking year. I mean, I could go on, but I want to get somebody else to go to speak.
You're welcome to carry on all night, Paul.
You can come back to me if you want.
Absolutely. I mean, you're seeing the great competition, James. Clark did win quite a few titles. Is he just transient?
3 or 4 in the 70s he won?
Mm-hmm. I think he won 3 in the 70s, 1 in the 60s, I think.
Yeah, I think it was 68 or 69 something.
Yeah. I mean, admittedly, the early 70s, there wasn't a lot of competition because there was only one team taking part seriously. It was only Ford, and Roger was obviously the main driver. The only competition he seemed to get really in the early 70s was from other drivers with a bit of Ford backing, like Coleman. I believe Chris Slater got a bit of backing at some point. He did pretty well.
He won.
He won, I think. Yeah, I think there were other teams did enter sort of briefly and had some fleeting success. I believe Brian Culture did win a Scottish, didn't he, in the big Triumph?
1970.
Yeah. But other than that, you did get the odd superstar visitor like Mikkola. It was only one-off events, and usually, even though he did miss some events, Roger did come out on top. Mm-hmm. And that is sort of the problem with the early 70s. As I said, from sort of 76 onwards, it's a totally different story. The competition did really take off, and it did become absolutely fantastic and part of the sort of thing we remember it as today.
Yourself, Dave?
Yeah, sort of the start of the professional era, wasn't it, the 70s? Like James was saying, the first half of the decade, there wasn't much going on there. It was quite a lot of Roger Clark domination. But I think after Roger's success on the 72 RAC, it got a lot more popular. and you started to get more British drivers coming through to get works drives like Pondy and Brooks, and eventually Jimmy McRae. And then obviously once it got to the mid-70s, it was just like the World Championship basically, wasn't it, with Marco Allen and all that, and Harry Vatanen. Yeah, that's basically, it was just the start of it, you know, going up another gear really. Set it up quite nicely for the 80s. When another thing about the 70s as well is that it was much easier for the club drivers to compete up there with the top guys, because you could buy your standard 1300 Escort and soon beef it up to a pretty similar spec car for not much money, and you could be, you know, finishing top 10 in international events. That's something that obviously slowly died as the decades went on. So that's probably the one thing that people look back on fondly, you know, be able to compete with the big guys at quite an even level, really.
Mm-hmm. For me, I think the landscape completely changed in the 70s. I think we're just getting away from the Cortinas and the Minis and stuff. And the Escort, I mean, I think it was at 68 the Escort came out.
Yeah.
The time that I hit the 70s, it was just a way. It was nothing was touching the Escort in the UK. But the amount of cars as well in the 70s, you know, that were competing for class. You don't get these amount of cars these days, different types. You had the Fulvia, Lancia, Saabs, Escorts, Cadets, Porsches, Stratos, 131s, Minis, TR7s, Datsun ZXs. There was a lot of people interested in rallying in Britain in those days. And I think a lot of that was down to Roger Clark. Yeah, you're right. You know, I mean, they seen what he could do. I think he won it, was it 72 he won it? When they thought it was not possible. But I think Blomqvist won from Harrogate it started, the REC that. And Roger went and won the REC in 72. And that really propelled the championship, all rallying. What about yourself, John?
I'm far too young to remember, obviously. I mean, I think looking back on it as an outsider, obviously it's the decade of the Escort, isn't it? You know, it was, but I think, you know, if you look a bit deeper, it was the decade where the sport in the UK at least went from being amateur and based very much on navigational events through to it being, you know, very professional. If you look at, you know, it was the Mini that won in 1970, wasn't it? And then in 1979, it was a Chevette HSR. And I think that shows the development in the sport. Because I think I read something that, you know, by that time, certainly into the early 80s, you know, they were doing special engines just for the rally cars and things. And rally development was leading road development. Whereas in the past, you know, it had been very much, you know, you were in a pretty standard road car. So I think it was a decade where rallying went from being an amateur kind of gentleman's game to being a professional sport. And, you know, by the end of the decade, we're seeing factory teams and the British Championship became very, very professional with professional drivers, professional teams. And we saw the kind of the explosion of the big British names, Clark, obviously, Brooks, Tony Pond, all these people. And then the Finns coming over, your Mikkelas and people, and you know, it just changed the sport forever, didn't it? The latter part of the decade.
There was so much to the 70s. I mean, the maps, everything was on maps, of course. Apart from the Manx, that was later on in the 70s. That was only around, I think, in the UK. It was on notes. With the more competitors coming into the sport, advertisers began to take notice as well. There was loads of advertisers out there, every garage. You know, if you stayed in the same town or village as a rally driver, you'd sponsor their car. I used to love it. You know, you'd see an old Escort and it would just be like emulsion paint, big stripe right on the side. Graham's Chippy and Duns or something. It was fantastic. I loved all that. It was all about cheapness as well. And talking of cheapness, people used to just get an Escort, chuck a sump guard on it, and a half cage, and they'd go and do the Scottish rally. It's incredible. You know, you just can't do that now. You know, the sport's changed so much.
No, I think you even look at the cars towards the end of the 70s, the Sunbeams and things. I mean, they were pretty basic machines compared to, you know, once we got into the 80s, the standard of cars transformed. And you know, even a decent Group 4 car is a pretty basic thing compared to, I mean, a Group N car from, you know, 15 years later.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. But I think rallying was so popular. I mean, there was also prize money as well. You know, in rallying in the 70s, quite a lot of prize money. I don't know if you've ever read Chris Slater's book. It's absolutely fantastic. He documented all his events and prize monies and start money, all this kind of stuff. It's really interesting. But I remember, I think Drew Gallagher, he won the Herring Dandy Rally in the late 70s. That was just a Scottish round, Scottish Championship round, and he got, I think it was £100 he got for that, which is worth over £800 today. You know, he just, that's another thing we don't get now, because, well, it's down to permits. I think if you give cash, your permit goes up if you give out cash rewards, you know. But the events were very long. I remember the Snowman Rally back then had 22 stages. That was just a day event. That's, I think, 76. I think I had 22 stages. That was, in fact, it was the BRC then. That's when you had the big boys, Vatanen and Roger Clark and that doing it. Although, to be fair, a lot of these events, especially in the 80s with like the Mintex and that, they had a lot of stages, but they were very short stages. 4 milers, you know. I don't think you could do that now because there's no manpower to look after these stages, but it was great as a spectator because you could hop between stages. There's more stages to hop between. Problem is, it might have been a bit frustrating for drivers to drive 30 miles to a 2 mile stage.
Yeah, I was going to mention that the rallies themselves definitely need a mention from the 70s because there's some phenomenally long events. I mean, look at, you know, the Scottish itself, that was sort of 4 days, 2 or 3 nights, wasn't it? And over 300 stage miles. And when you consider like a modern WRC event's got about 200, the Scottish BRC had about 350. It's nearly twice the length of the WRC event. And as you said, you know, if you were following it round, you could get to multiple stages, you know, 4 or 5 a day if you kind of didn't need any sleep. So, and the Welsh as well, you know, that was sort of a 2-day, 2-night event. It was crisscrossed the country and almost every forest in Wales was used. You know, that had sort of 35, 40 stages. Our own Mintex rally in Yorkshire was similar. It had sort of 35, 40 stages. It got even more than that when more forest became available in the sort of 80s. I mean, obviously beefed it with a few sort of airfields and the 70s. It was, you know, you spend sort of like a Friday, Saturday, Sunday out at a rally.
More than that as well.
Yeah.
I think a big attraction in the 70s was the social side of events, especially the Scottish rally. It was famous. It was like a drink up here, you know. It was equally renowned for its social side. When it went to Granton-on-Spey and places like Aviemore as a start and finish venue, it was just massive party, and that was during the event as well. Whereas in the 80s, the event moved to Glasgow. I think it was 82. It moved to Glasgow, and because it was a big city, everybody was more spaced out. You know, so there wasn't the party atmosphere. You couldn't just congregate in one big pub or hotel. So that kind of ruined it as well. But the social aspects were huge in the 70s. In fact, I remember reading an article, I can't remember who wrote it, and they were saying that they did a rally in Ireland in the 70s, and the rallies used to start at lunchtime, and the drivers and the stewards used to be have a drink before it. True story.
That's Ireland for you.
Aye. So,
well, similar to the circuit of Ireland in the 70s, that was renowned, wasn't it? Particularly when the overnight halt at Killarney, wasn't it? They just get there about sort of 2 o'clock Saturday afternoon. The rally wouldn't restart till sort of 7 a.m. Sunday morning. And then that leg would be over by sort of lunchtime Sunday. There'd be sort of a 24-hour rest before it started again on Monday. So everyone just got hammered, apparently, on Easter Sunday night.
Right.
What was the rally they used to do in Scotland that went through the night and then it finished like breakfast the next day, and then the dolls go straight to the pub after that one as well?
Burma or something like that, was it?
It's Burma one, yeah. That was another big piss up. That's probably why you got so many characters as well in the 70s, wasn't it? Because of the social aspect, I think.
They do say that Clark was renowned. He did like a drink, and he'd just sit and have a drink with anybody in the bar, sort of thing. And he was quite approachable by all accounts, you know.
Dickie Davis.
So you can't imagine that now, can you?
Remember Dickie Davis? World of Sport.
Yeah, he's got the idea, hasn't he? Yeah.
Davis's Tache. He was a big Tache. He was. There was a story about, was it Peter Ashcroft went into the pub?
Yeah.
Scottish. And him and Dickie Davis were leathered. And he says, "Right, come on, Roger." Roger says, "You should take care of the car. I'll take care of the driving. On you go." Peter Ashcroft made choice. He just walked out. You know. But another thing about the 70s was there was a ladder of opportunity. You know, you used to, if you performed well in a championship, say the Castle Auto Sport Championship, 76 onwards, if you were leading Group 1, Ford would come along and give you a brand new car, repair and bits. You know, the manufacturers wanted you to win. You know, I can see why a lot of people would suggest the 70s are the best era. Landowners seem to give up their land constantly for rallying. I don't know how many permits the MSA gave out in those days, but there was rallies on every weekend. You know, not there was also the road rallies as well, which are dangerous. Let's face facts.
Group 4 cars on public roads.
Well, that got later on, didn't it, with the motor news, the early 80s. It's incredible. But no, is anybody else any more thoughts about the 70s?
Just kind of relates back to what you were just saying. I can see why some people do love it as the best decade. The particular thing is that the cars and drivers are so much closer to ordinary people, or what an ordinary person could afford. And that was part of the attraction, I believe, in the 70s, that you could buy a standard car. You did okay. Ford would sort of like be quite happy to kind of sponsor you or give you a few sort of service sort of personnel or parts, just because it made them look better, that they're in their role because they're doing well. Again, you just can't really sort of imagine that kind of parallel now.
Well, that's completely changed. I don't know if I'm not sure if many sports have changed as much as rallying has, to be honest with you. The whole structure, you know. I know it's still man and machine against time and distance. From a spectator's point of view, you know, everything's changed so much. And the public's desire for rally is changing as well, you know, sadly. So we'll move on to the 80s. I think we'll give Mr. Scoltock has to go first.
Oh, the 80s. I think, I mean, turbulence is a word that springs to mind for me with the 80s in a way, because I think it was a time when the technology changed a lot, wasn't it? There was still a lot of increase in professionalism, and we moved to more pace notes and things like that. But I think the cars came on a lot. I mean, you can't talk about the 80s and not talk about the Audi Quattro, can you? Which just changed everything. You know, it introduced turbocharging, but most significantly four-wheel drive. And weirdly, at world level, it did change everything. But in the British Championship, I mean, Mantas and things were still winning when the Audis were there, which seems a bit weird in a way. But I mean, the Audi perhaps wasn't always the most reliable car, I suppose. So I think it's technology, isn't it? But over the course of the decade, obviously, we saw that Group B got canned, so we kind of had another challenge in that people had to kind of go backwards a little bit and go down to Group A cars. I think it was another decade of big change, but in a really sort of in a quite a different way. I think but you know, there's a lot of challenges to the sport, I think, at that time. But again, you saw a big jump in the professionalism. list of drivers that were competing on BRC events was still, you know, world level, wasn't it? Michel Mouton and people coming over and doing events. So it was still, you know, it was a massive deal again. It was another big step up in so many ways over the 70s.
I think it was a great point you made there, John, about the Quattro. What an impact. Incredible. You know, I mean, I think its first event was the 82 Mintex in Britain. And it just flew. Nothing could get near it, you know. I think it was actually Saab that introduced the turbo to the BRC.
Yeah,
79 with Stig. But no, the Quattro deserves a bit of time, you know, in my opinion. A lot of people think the car destroyed rallying because it was four-wheel drive. It couldn't get touched in the forests. I don't personally think that. I just think it was evolution. You know, I remember Phil Collins had a jacket. Do you remember the jacket? Quattros are boring. Remember that? You had that in the back. Do any of you guys think Quattros were boring?
Definitely not. Just the sound of them is enough alone.
When I was a kid, and I wanted Jimmy McRae and Russell Brooks to win all the time, and Tony Pond, I just kind of, I got annoyed because they couldn't win in the forest because of that car. I felt that aspect was boring. The forest events were pretty much a foregone conclusion once that car came along. But it wasn't actually a boring car to watch. I mean, I've seen it now with my own eyes and ears. Stig Blomqvist arriving actually, you know, at right angles to the road with the fire coming out the back. That's not a boring sight and sound. It really isn't. It's like a monster.
Absolutely.
You know, people called it a monster, and it literally wasn't. It was like a fire-breathing sort of four-wheel drive dragon.
I agree with you, James. It was you mentioned Stig. When Hanu was brought in to drive the car, he was brought in because he wasn't avatting him with Escort. You know, he was not over the limit. He drove the car very kind of straightish a lot, and his development skills were fantastic as well. So they brought him in for the Quattro. So in 81 and 82, Hanu cleaned up, 82 in the BRC, Hanu cleaned up in the gravel rounds and stuff. But when Blomqvist came in 83, the car was sideways everywhere. You know, it was as sideways in some Benz's Escorts. It looked great, sounded great. I don't know why people dislike the car so much. I don't think it killed the sport in any way. I think it opened the door, kicked open the door to more four-wheel drives coming in, better competition and faster sport. You know,
I wonder if I think they're referring to it down the ladder slightly. Certainly, I think there was a bit of jealousy in the national championship when Darrell Wheaton got his Quattro. Because he was a decent enough driver in an Escort, but he weren't really sort of championship material. And he got that Quattro and he just walked away from everyone in the national championship, didn't he, as well? So people who previously kind of would have been beating him in Escorts didn't like it. I think that's where the Quattros are boring, and a lot of the kind of reluctance to appreciate comes from the people I've spoken to anyway that were around then.
That's a really good point. And I don't know who's watching this, but there was a lot of bang average drivers that did really well in 6R4s when they come out as well. I mean, the Clubman version just got sold off to everybody in Folklore finishing first, second, third. That we'd never have done that in equal cars. Well, a lot of the drivers that were already competing, you know, so I could imagine a bit of jealousy. But I actually like the 80 Quattro. I know it sounds daft. You know, the one that Dal drove with the spoiler in the back. I thought it was terrific.
Yeah.
The first time I saw one was 83 Scottish, Andrew Cowan, and Alan Douglas was in it. And they looked that great, but
nearly killed me on that rally.
Really?
Yeah, we shouldn't have stood on that, shall we say, but no one controlled the crowd so much. And did the you'll know the bending Twigleys, Bob. They were near the public road.
Yeah, so you're right.
You know, very fast straight. His tyre tracks were kind of like must be not far off us. Never forget it to this day. I just thought my days were up when I was about 9.
Good memories, eh?
Yeah, brilliant.
Dave?
Yeah, the beginning of the 80s is one of my favourite periods of the BRC, when it's still Group 4 going slightly to Group B. There's just so many big names in it then. It's incredible to watch. The rallies are just amazing. And then when it gets to about 83, 84, when you've got the Quattros and the Mantas, I think it sort of dips a bit because, like you were saying, it gets a bit predictable. The Quattros always won on gravel. The Mantas would win on tarmac. But then when Group B became a bit more accessible and you got the T16s and the 6R4s come in, it really picked up again in like 86. And then, like what John was alluding to, when Group A came, it was a bit of a difficult transition. But I think it was also pretty interesting because you had such a variety of cars, you know, like Opel Monzas, Mitsubishi Starions and that. It was pretty interesting to watch that. And then it ended with the Celica came with David Llewellyn, and again it was a bit like the Quattros, just dominating on gravel. But I think overall the 80s is probably the strongest decade when you look overall at it. The level of competition, the drivers that came, and the teams that were involved. Like we were saying about the mid-70s, it was pretty much just another world championship, series, wasn't it?
I mean, I just want to say about the 80s, one of the things that made it better for me, but drivers and cars come and go, ultimately dictate by what's being built at the time. But the rallies themselves, the championship was structured and organised, I felt was great in the 80s. Because I think in the 70s, they had probably too many events and it was a bit sprawling. But when they sort of went down to sort of those 5-6 events, and they were all great rallies, all different challenges. And it just led to sort of, most of the drivers did all of them. And it just led to sort of so much close competition, even though, the Quattro dominated on one service, the Mantas on the other. I think that sort of streamlining of the actual series itself was one of the great things that happened in the 80s.
That's a very good point. I like the structure as well. I think you had the national breakdown, didn't you? Then it was Welsh in the circuit.
Circuit of Ireland, Scottish, Ulster, Manx.
It was every year was the same.
Yeah.
I like
every rally was one that you looked forward to and really sort of wanted to follow and get to if you could.
For me, I think the 80s were fantastic. Got to disagree with you, David, about thinking it tailed off in 83 because of the domination. I think the drivers in that period were incredible. You're seeing Vatanen, Toivonen, McRae on the Manx and Eco Machinery and even 84 and 85, you had the best, you had Mouton, Blomqvist. The world's best were here. And it was just incredible rally. And it was even Russell Brooks and Terry Keeby in the Chevettes. They were just brilliant, But for me, the 80s rally, I just remember a convoy, massive convoy of rally cars, service vans heading up to places like Fort William for the 10 to midnight service. And you're talking hundreds rally. All the folk are out at night on roundabouts, kids clapping. And I think you actually felt part of the event, when you were doing it, because they're waving, all these folk waving and that. But that was, I'll never forget going into Fort William 10 to 12 at night. The whole town was out, the generators, the chippy was open, there was queues, and it was just a massive buzz. Everybody. It was great. And I've never seen nothing like it. As a young boy, I'd never really been out at Fife. And the next minute I'm in this convoy thinking this is the greatest thing in the world, The late 80s. Well, I think the events, let's talk about the events as well. I mean, the length of the events was incredible. Some of the Scottishes had 58, 59 stages. Trumantal was 15. They weren't all short stages, the real tough ask. I will never know. I mean, I compete in single venues and I will never know how they've got the fitness in those days. with the less quality seats. You know, how do they maintain that level of concentration, read pace notes and drive like that for 5 days, 4 or 5 days?
So, I mean, if you look at something like the Mintex or National Breakdown, if you get all of the sorts of the route maps and the stage maps, that rally lasted probably about 26 hours, with like a 3-hour stop in midnight or something, and that had 50 stages on it. So there was going all like non-stop, apart from like a cup of tea or something in Scarborough.
Well, what I would say to that is, though, they did have stuff like Dolby 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There was loads of stages, but they were small, you know.
They sometimes make 3 or 4 Dolby stages, but I think they did sort of start to link Dolby up a bit later on. Mm-hmm. We did get a 20-miler in a couple of years.
I was going to say, they normally did one big, long Dolby stage, I think, just to test them.
Yeah. And then they did the short one was the Michael's Bend one, I think.
I'm not going to argue with you guys using Yorkshire Mafia. Or using the right.
We've got backup as well. It's not just us two.
Aye.
Who else?
I think so. Someone made an interesting point when they were talking about Group A coming in with I think one of the things that made that exciting was everyone was scrabbling around to find a car that worked, weren't they?
Yeah.
And one of the things that, because I mean, Lancia, there wasn't that many Lancias in the UK, obviously, but they were quite well placed in that they had a car that worked and would work everywhere. But I mean, I don't think anyone else could really say that. I think that led to some really good battles. You know, we had the Sierras, which were good on tarmac and kind of ish worked on gravel, but were horrendously fast, but a bit hard to drive. And I think as Dave said about the Celica coming along, I think that was the point, wasn't it, where people thought, okay, Group A is going to work here, isn't it? Group A is the future. That was the car that I think it ideally set us up to go into the next decade, wasn't it? But I think if you look at those at 87, 88, I was doing some reading the other day about the World Championship, and Lancia showed up with the Delta and won. But I mean, they were the only people who had a car that was any good for everything. And everyone, Starions and things were exciting, but probably not that good a car as a all-round rally car. And I think that kind of mix up at the end of that period. And I read something a while ago on Group N, and it was in a Cars and Car Conversion magazine. They did a 3-way test between 3 Group N cars: a Sierra, a Lancia, and a Mazda. I mean, they were all totally different in how they drove and the kind of level they were at. I think that, in a way, kind of took it back to the old days in a way, and that it kind of mixed things up a bit, didn't it?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I sort of liked about the late 80s, and let's just sort of what you were saying, it all become this sort of seismic kind of change of Group B happening and coming and going abruptly. And as you say, so many cars were out there, no one knew which worked well. It was quite an interesting time. I never recall seeing a variety of machinery than the other periods as then. So many different cars, and because of it, sort of good drivers who had maybe been out of favour before during Group B came back in. Such, for example, Penty, his career got a sort of resurgence, didn't it, in '87, and he got a sort of Mansa drive and a Vauxhall drive, and his career took off again in his 40s. But you also had the same Jimmy McRae and Russell Brooks survived it, but then you had younger British drivers come through and doing that period, like Llewellyn and Lovell as well. And with hindsight, it was actually a pretty good era, sort of 87, 88, 89. Still, all the best drivers in Britain had a really decent drive in the championship.
Yeah. I think you could argue, and you guys probably have more experience of this than me, but I wonder if that kind of pulling back to Group A actually helped, not just in the top classes, but I think in those early days of Group A, I think you could argue that those in lower class cars had more of a chance. And as people said in the comments about our last video, Dave Metcalfe, who was the best British driver in history, could
edit this out, Bob.
put a Nova into a pretty high position, or an Astra, or whatever it may be, and Colin McRae as well. And And those lower class cars had a chance, you know, they had more of a chance to impress in those cars because they could get a bit closer to a Group A Sierra than they were ever going to get to a Group B car.
Yeah, it's a good point. There wasn't as much performance gap between the cars because they were all trying to be a top Group A car, so they weren't really focusing on being the best 1600 or whatever. So that's why it made it so interesting, just that, you know, that variety of engine sizes, car sizes, and it definitely made the drivers work for a living.
Definitely.
Costs went down, so entries went right up. The Group A, you know, these international, the BRC events, I got entries once it went to Group A as well. It's interesting talking about the Sierras were in place. I think it was 86. They had the Securicor Challenge.
Yeah,
they did the national championship, so they were handily placed for the 87 Group A. But I remember Russell Brooks actually said that the fastest car he'd ever driven was the Sierra Cosworth, a lot faster than the Manta 400. And I think a lot of that comes down to, I don't know about your perception, but to me, if you watch one, you think the Manta's quickest every time, but it's the noise. Just the noise. And I don't want to hack on about the future of rally cars with no noise, basically. But
the Manta is possibly the loudest rally car I've ever heard. People will say the Stratos, but that car made your insides rattle.
To me, it's the best sounding rally car of all time.
It's a loud car, definitely.
Oh, amazing. I love it. Too many escorts out there for me, honestly. Get rid of them.
I agree.
Any more about the 80s?
That's about it, I think.
Right.
It's a great decade.
Who has not went first in the 90s? Must be Dave.
Must be Dave.
Must be Dave. So
he starts off, he's still got the Group A cars, but now it's getting into the serious Japanese four-wheel drive stuff. And this is where the entries start to go down a bit, isn't it? Because the cars are starting to get quite advanced and expensive. But we did see the rise of young Colin McRae, Alistair McRae, Richard Burns. So those names make it memorable just for that, you know, those guys getting on the scene. And there wasn't too much competition in those days, but like I say, it was still important for those drivers to sort of win that championship to progress onto the World Championship. But I think the saving for the BRC in the 90s was obviously the switch to Formula 2 in the mid-90s. All the manufacturers came back, the competition was close, you started getting drivers from different countries coming over again, and it just created a good atmosphere again, sort of hark back to the 70s, all those pure, naturally aspirated engines. It's good times.
James?
The 90s, yeah. I think just related to what Dave was saying there about the early 90s not being all that great competition-wise. I think at the time there was a bit of an economic recession in the country, early 90s. And I think that did sort of damage rallying quite a lot. It wasn't a lot of spare money around for people, and entries were low. The manufacturers seemed to sort of not be entering en masse anymore. I think you had Llewellyn in the Sleeker GT4 at the start that pretty much walked the championship, possibly the most one-sided championship that I remember. I think he would have won it every round apart from his turbo blowing on the end of the cartel that time. We still had Malcolm Wilson and Colin in rear-wheel drive Sierras, who was still great to watch. So it wasn't all sort of dull if, you know, being out there. I think Gwyndaff in the Group N car, I think Louise Aitken-Walker had the Cosworth as well at the time. I mean, there were some good British drivers out there with decent cars. But Dave's absolutely right. The F2 era, when that came in, about 94, 95-ish, that was fantastic. Half a dozen or more manufacturers, all with a car such as Formula, screaming, howling, aspirated engines in the forest, echoing for miles and miles. I've got a particular memory of I did the Pirelli about 97. I was on the sort of long Thunder Show stage on the Sunday morning, 27-mile stage, I think, something like that, in the BRC. Just hearing cars coming from all directions. About 25 minutes before I think Gwyndaff in the F2 escort the first car through. But it could be any of them. They're all sort of on the stage revving bollocks off, you know. It was a fantastic era of cars, and also it brought on so many good British drivers, give them a great chance, and it was evenly matched. The pace was just furious. A lot of action. It's because people were pushing the cars over the limit, I think. Great to watch. Obviously, it didn't bring on any world champions like the early 90s did. You know, it'd be wrong not to mention that Colin and Richard and Alistair all came out of the early 90s. But as a spectator in the Forest, F2 was as good as it got for me.
You could argue that. I mean, was it 97? Alistair got his big drive. Is that 97?
Yeah. VW, was it?
With Volkswagen.
Yeah.
You could say that the F2 was the making of him. You know?
Yeah.
I think the F2 was a shot in the arm that the BRC needed. It really did, because it was. Although in saying that, in 91, was it? 91, Colin, you had the Subaru entered come to the table, didn't it? Subaru, the Legacy.
Yeah.
And 92. And he was against, was it Brooksy in the four-wheel drive Sierra. In 93, he still had Malcolm Wilson. And he was against the Legacies, wasn't he? The LNX Legacies, Burnsy and Alistair.
Yeah.
I would always like to have seen how Llewellyn would have got on in 93, driving the Celica against the Subarus and Malcolm. That would have been really interesting.
Oh, stop putting Y's on the other people's name. It upsets the people.
I know. Better watch what I'm saying. For me, my memories of the F2 cars were the stage Langton and Duns and the Jim Clark. There was a bridge and the McGann at night was pitch black. It was pitch black most of the time in Scotland. That's just the clouds and the rain. You know? So you could have stood under this McGann. He was going so fast. He was flat out for about a mile, and he just took off, and he just landed in sparks of it. He just kept going, and it was hard to comprehend. Just incredible, you know. That's my memory. Craig, the flying finish of Craig as well, one of the McGanns, just absolutely flat out down there, and I just shook my head.
Yeah, the McGanns were impressive.
These guys in these F2 cars were faster than the guys in the 70s.
Yeah. I mean, didn't they rev at something like 12,000 RPM, some of the F2 cars? The engine rebuild every rally with that.
The Hondas
and they weighed less than a ton, didn't they? So it was a great combination.
But do you know, only one driver won the title twice in the 90s. That was Colin. Yeah. That gives you a kind of gauge of the competition, the competitiveness.
Definitely, yeah.
You know, so aye. Has anybody else not said anything about the 90s yet?
John.
Yeah,
oh, John.
Wind me up and watch me go.
No.
I think in terms of the early 90s, I think you guys have covered the main points, really. I think the main thing for that was the rise of McRae and Burns, wasn't it? I think it maybe wasn't the most competitive era, but it gave those guys the start. Renault, I think, is a really interesting one. I think they probably deserve a lot of credit, because when they joined in 95 with the Clio, that was the first full year of F2, wasn't it? And the Clio was not a very good gravel car. Not actually a very good tarmac car in the UK. It was too stiff. So for them to come back for 96 and do the entire championship with the McGann, which couldn't even score points in 96 because kit cars weren't allowed. That was a big step for them to do that, and and run a factory team when they couldn't even win the championship. And I think, but it showed their intent, didn't it? And they went on to win in 98 and 99, didn't they, with Martin Rowe and Tapio Lagerton. So I think I think, and it showed how important it was, wasn't it? It was still the big championship that, you know, if you wanted to break into the World Championship, you had to do the British Series, and you know, you look at the drivers that were doing it, the British drivers that you guys have already mentioned, but you were still getting Finns coming over and doing it. Harry Rovanperä did it in 97, I think, and guys like that. Stig was still doing it in a Skoda in 97, 98, and scoring good results. And I think one of the other big things that always jumps out at me is that I think it was a pretty good time for one make series again, and Peugeot put a lot of effort in at that time with 306s, then 106s, and that brought a lot of drivers through as well. Justin Dale, Ryan Champion, and people like that who maybe didn't quite make it into the world scene, but in British terms, you know, were really, really good drivers. And I think, you know, again, it shows the manufacturer support, doesn't it? You know, we had them, Seat. I'd love to say Ford because I think the Escort Max is probably my favourite rally car ever. But I mean, that was Gordon Spooner Engineering did that car on their own pretty much. So Seat, who, you know, put a lot of effort into the championship towards the end of the decade. I think one of the things that always stands out for me is from the 90s is those funny big hand foam hand things that we're giving to everyone.
I had a few of them.
Yeah, you know, the merchandise and the energy they were pushing into it. I mean, I've tucked away somewhere, got, you know, posters and magazines and things they were doing pretty much just about what they were doing over here. So, you know, they were putting so much energy into it, and that the competition as well. I think 97, I would say, is probably the best year ever in the British Championship. I think, was it 5 drivers could have won going into the max?
I think so, yeah.
Crashed. Alistair crashed. Robbie Head blew his engine, I think, didn't he, after a naughty downshift? It was just a mega time, wasn't it? But they had the budget, and they were driving someone else's car.
Yeah.
They were trying to get to the World Championship. You rolled it into a ball.
Yeah, not even mentioned Mark Higgins in this song yet, have we?
No.
Great sort of driving, a great era. Same stage in Pondy show. I think he used to be in the second car, but he was missing. Then he came through about the 5th car, absolutely flat out with a flat roof and the windscreen missing, but still just kind of like not even slowing down. This is proper rallying, you know.
Was it 96 he broke his back? He had an accident.
Yeah, on the Pirelli.
Yeah. It was strange because when he won 97, didn't he? But he'd gone under it all year in that Nissan, which I think the Nissan was probably the best pure breed bay car. But you know, once the kit car started to come in, it probably wasn't the best car. But I think he only won one rally.
Yeah, the Ulster, yeah.
Binned it.
Lucky wasn't he mind the Manx when he went up on.
Oh yeah, with the wheel. At the wheel,
the
state, yeah.
He must have thought that was game over, surely.
Yeah.
The accidents on that rally alone show the commitment, though, don't they? Alistair McRae's crashing a Golf, which I'm sure is on YouTube somewhere.
Well, yeah,
touch of the wheel on the grass and just boom, gone.
Yeah. Oh God, yeah. I think the Pirelli was as bad. Wasn't there something like? Am I right in thinking Robbie Head won that rally?
Yeah.
He used to have a last stage 4th, I believe in 3 cars all rolled, didn't they, or something on that last stage? The competition was that frenetic.
I don't know if Stig was like second or something as well in the Skoda.
Yeah, that's right.
I
remember sort of the TV interview with McRae said at the end, and like he goes, I think he might have won Heady at the end to
What was he? What did they call him again? Hector. I think you've won Hector. That's right.
Yeah.
The only thing I didn't like about the F2 period was too many Group N Mitsubishis. Ollie Harkey, all these people. Oh.
I was gutted when those cars actually won rallies outright.
Yeah. Trying to win the Scottish that year.
90s. Yeah. Was it 96 or 7? They won outright, didn't they? One of the two.
96. I think Harry Rovanperä won, didn't he?
Yeah. David Higgins had a couple of good results in his. It was a Subaru or a Mitsubishi.
Yeah.
So,
it shows the strength of the band, though, didn't it? I think.
What was your favourite, James? What was your favourite F2 car?
My favourite F2 car, wow. I could pick about 3 or 4 of them. The Megans were superb. I like the Nissan. I like the Seat. I like the VW. I'll probably just go for the sheer out and out noise and sort of fury. I've got to go for the Megane though. It was a fair old sight and sound.
Dave?
Yeah, I agree with that. The Megane was always my favourite. I love all the kit cars, like even the Nissan Micra is a a funky little car. But the Megane just had the sound, and like you were saying before in the Pirelli rally, when all the sparks used to come off the bottom of the car when it was pelting along. The sound of it when it was struggling for grip as well, and it's just bouncing off the limiter. Yeah, that's really left some memories there for me.
I'm going to get in here before John. I'm going to say that the best looking F2 car for me was Gwyndaf's F2 Escort, the one with the wide arches.
Yeah.
Was it the silver one? Was it the
Yeah.
Ulster? Or the Manx?
Yeah. 97. Through, mate.
Beautiful. So you can't pick the same one, John. So what are you going for? I'm only kidding, pal, because here's an Escort.
Well, I own an Escort, so I kind of have to say that.
Okay.
No, I think Dave's right when he said about the Micra. What that era proved is that you can make any car look amazing if you put massive wheel arches on it.
Yeah.
Skoda as a road car was pretty awful, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Put big in it and put wide arches on it, and it's suddenly brilliant, and you want one. All right, if I'm not allowed to say the Escort, I don't want to say Megane either. I always liked the 306, but that was the one that we never got, wasn't it? Which is a bit of a shame. I would never bring it over. I do have a bit of a soft spot for the Saxo Super 1600, though, so I'll probably go for that.
Okay. Well, it's time now to pick your favourite era. Get in reverse order, in fact. In third place, James, in third place.
Oh, in third place, I'm gonna. Oh, it's just so I could make a proper case for all the eras, but somebody's got to come last. As I didn't see it, I'm gonna have to say the 70s in third.
Okay.
Which will get me shot on a lot of websites, sure.
Second,
I'm going to go for the 90s, just because only the second half of it was truly great.
John.
Well, it looks like I'm also going to get murdered because I would also put the 70s in third place, because I did some stats and there was a lot of different driver winners, but it was just, I mean, one car dominated, and yeah, so third for me. Second place, I'll probably also get shot, but I'm going to put the 80s in second.
Okay.
Which
Dave?
means 90s number one.
Yeah, the 70s would be third for me as well, just because I don't really relate to that period. I'm really torn between the top two. The 90s is the only one that I lived and breathed, and I've got all the memories of those kit cars. But then again, when you watch back the 80s videos, it's hard to go against them, isn't it? I probably have to say the 90s is second then.
Oof.
And obviously the 80s first.
You're just saying that because of Tony Pond.
Is he?
Because
You mean Pondy?
The third place for me, I'm going to go the 90s.
Ooh.
Second will be the 70s. First 80s. My reason for that really is the 70s were fantastic, and the early 80s had all the attributes of the 70s, but the cars were faster. That makes sense.
Yeah.
The 70s changed everything for the sport. more professional, etc. And in the 80s, it just lit up. I didn't enjoy the early 90s at all, to be honest with you. So that's, for me, there was only 5 years. And that was F2 cars, which were great. So I'm going for the 80s and number 1 spot. And I'll tell you something, folk are not going to be happy. Because there's a lot of 70s lovers out there.
I know. I've just lost lots of friends with this, I think.
Oh. But no, anyway, we're going to call this a day, I think, guys. Because I know that you guys for Yorkshire are going to go home and make some dripping pieces and take your kestrel out to the moors, stuff like that.
I've got some ferrets in my trouser legs I need to get out.
Anyway, I better thank my sponsors once again for tonight.
They might not sponsor us for putting the 70s solo.
I know. We'll have to re-record this, Bob, and take 2, the 70s win.
It's fine. It's the truth.
Right, a big thank you to ScottishGritting.com and Harkness Competition Tyres. And we hope to see you soon for the next edition of Pondy's Tache. Thank you for watching.